Welcome to the first session of Digital Futures for 2026. Today, I'm delighted to have as our guest Chris Williamson, the current president of the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and someone I met a few years ago at an event in London. And he invited me to take part in a subsequent event at the RIBA, at which Stuart Russell was the keynote speaker. Stuart Russell, as many of you will know, is one of the leading voices on AI. He's not an architect, he's a computer scientist. He is from the UK, but he's based in UC Berkeley in the Bay Area, around San Francisco. And I think this was an enormously inspired and provocative move to bring the world of AI into the hall of the RIBA itself. Chris was subsequently voted in as the president of the RIBA. He's only been there for a few months. Chris has his background is he's very much a working class hero, shall we say. I was brought up with Roy of the Rovers and that kind of mythology. And Chris's accent, I think, is a Derbyshire accent. I used to teach at the University of Nottingham. I sort of recognize it in some senses. And he's come from a very modest background to go to the very top of his profession. He is a partner of Weston Williamson, one of the leading UK architectural practices, well known particularly for its work on transportation and so on. Chris, it's a great honor and a privilege to have you today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be invited. Thanks for the introduction.
So, Chris, I wonder if you could say something about your background, especially coming from those kind of working class roots. How did you come to be an architect in the first place? And what was your journey, basically?
Um, this is going to be a bit like therapy for me, I think, because I came from a small. You're quite right about the accent. I came from a small village between Nottingham and Derby, a place called Stanley. So the nearest town was Ilkeston, and that's where I went to school. But Stanley was a very small village of about, less than 1,000 people. And I was born in a council estate. And my dad died when I was 3, and he had been a lay preacher. I came from quite a religious background. So from the age of 6 to 16, I sang in the church choir, and the local vicar was quite disappointed when I told him I was going to study architecture instead of theology. He thought I would follow in his footsteps. But to me, so what happened was I got a place at Leicester Poly to study graphic design. But then one wet Wednesday afternoon, I picked up a book on architecture, which was actually published by the RIBA. And it described everything that an architect did and about the values that the architect had to uphold, not just to serve the client, but to have a social conscience and to be part of the community and represent society, not just the person that paid him. So to me, that was a bit like being a vicar. It had everything about what a vicar did. And to me, architecture, I mean, a lot of people will be annoyed by this and think it's heretical. But to me, architecture is a religion. I do firmly believe that it benefits society. It looks after the well-being, not just mental and physical, but spiritual well-being of us all as well. And I think most architects are quite evangelical about what we do, and it does become a vocation, I think. So I think I begged Leicester Poly to let me study architecture instead of graphic design. And it was the single best decision I've ever made. It's not just given me a living as an architect, but I think it's a cause. I think most architects I know are very passionate about their own brand of architecture. And sometimes we are so passionate about our own particular concerns that we don't tend to acknowledge that other people have a different point of view. But I think it's a fantastic career to be involved in, and that's why I want to make sure that it still thrives for young architects in the future. So, as regards my sort of background, I was the first in my family to go to university, and it was architecture being one of the professions, so called. It wasn't something that's put forward to working class kids, and I think that's something I'm passionate about, getting more diversity into the profession and making sure the things that you're doing with democratizing education is fantastic. And I think using technology is really important. So I think they're the sort of things that I'm looking forward to in my presidency, is getting more diversity into the profession and getting the RIBA to be as passionate about young architects as they have been in my lifetime, because the RIBA has been very important throughout my career.
Chris, you are the president at a kind of crucial time in terms of the profession itself. It's going through, I would say, a tough time in many countries, and I think, but especially including the UK. How do you see? What are your real? What is? How are you going to step up to meet those particular challenges? Maybe I could just kind of comment on one sense. I was very struck, having done quite a bit of work in China, by the situation there, in the sense that what's happened in China before even the introduction of AI was that the profession was on a back foot, partly because of the salaries being offered to architects, which are a result of the competition that was going on between firms, so that salaries dropped and the cultural status of architecture dropped. These days, it's relatively easy to get into some of the elite universities like Tongji and Tsinghua that used to be almost impossible to get into. And in fact, in Wuhan, which is famous because that's where COVID comes from, they had one applicant for architecture this year, and they ended up canceling the whole program. How do you see, this particular challenge which we are facing? Do you think it's redeemable in some ways? Can we get back to a position where we can really where the status of architecture is something like it was in a few years back?
I think so. I think it's really, and so I agree with you. It's a very challenging time, but it's also a time of great possibilities. I really do think we're in a sort of third Renaissance. You know, the Renaissance of Leonardo and Michelangelo, and in the 16th century was a rediscovery of antiquity, and there was a real thirst for learning. And that, I think the second one was in the Victorian times when we had the Industrial Revolution, and you know, there was a great thirst for knowledge, and we did the most fantastic architecture and social uh, building as well, and a real improvement in improving the quality of people's lives. And the third one now we're in the middle of. The surprising thing now is that we've got so much more information and access to so much more educational alternatives, but we're not actually making the most of it, and that's the worrying thing. But I think you mentioned China, and I mean some of the best architecture, some of the best thinking is, and a lot of refurbishment, a lot of sustainable projects, a lot of the most creative designs are coming out of China at the moment. But I think there has been a loss of prestige of architecture. But then that's true of all the professions. I mean, everything is being democratized, and in some ways that's a good thing. But it does mean, I mean, you never go to the doctors these days without looking up online what you might have or getting a second opinion or going to two or three alternatives, looking up, you know, you don't take advice from a lawyer for granted these days. I don't think, I think the professions as a whole are 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 viewed with some skepticism. So I think that's part of society and again access to information. But the title of you gave for this discussion was using a quote from Hamlet, and that the fuller quote is quite, when you read it out, it's actually quite prescient because you know the fuller quote is whether it is nobler in the mind to be suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take arms against a sea of troubles. And I think that's the position we're in. We either accept where we are and rail against it or try and do something about it. So I think what we need to try and do about it is to ensure that we can convince society and decision makers and politicians that we are as good as we know we are. And I think the way to do that is to use the initials of the RIBA and other professional institutes around the world as seen as a qualification and as so I'm not at all protectionist about what architects should or shouldn't be able to do, but I think just in the way that doctors and lawyers have some regulation about what they can do, quite rightly, then there ought to be, when it comes to public safety and uh, competence, there ought to be some regulation about what architects could do. And we've lost that. And it's partly our fault, but that's what we've got to strive to get back to, I think.
You mentioned the Renaissance. Maybe I could just I don't know if you're aware of this, but I was the translator of Alberti's book on architecture. And
Oh.
what is interesting about this is like 1450, right? It was the first book to be published on architecture because although Vitruvius came before, it was not published by them. But in that book, he gives a definition of the architect that is quite important. Well, it is the definition that we have held to until, I guess, fairly recently. Because, you know, at the time, there was a debate who was the architect. And he's what he says in the first page of the first book on architecture to be published is that he gives a definition. And what he tries to do is move away from an understanding they had in the past. They thought the word architect came from the Latin, arcus and tectum, to do with covering the roof. And he said, no, it's just come from the Greek, and it means arch, as an archangel, as an archenemy, the chief tectonic, the chief builder. And he makes this comment. The person he defines the architect. It's not a builder. It's not a construction person. It's someone who's in charge of all this. The construction worker is but a tool in the hand of the architect. And this definition, I think, has held right the way through until recently. And I think in some sense it's been undermined by some kind of contractual issues where design build has come in, especially in the UK, I think. And the architect's no longer in charge. You know, it's there's been a shift already. And it's that particular shift, I think, which is kind of, in a sense, an ongoing challenge.
Well,
What do
yeah,
you
I think you're right. I mean, there is a vision. I mean, and it's partly our own fault that we do tend to make design the be all and end all. All our architectural awards are about design, and you know that we don't really acknowledge that it's a team effort, and because buildings are now so complicated, we you know we still like to think of ourselves as Christopher Wren, who's the master builder, but in reality, we might coordinate a lot of things, but we don't do everything, and we have to acknowledge that we rely on a lot of other specialisms. So that's one of my major platforms when I was standing for the RIBA was trying to ensure that we bring into our profession more of our specialists, because I think people who manage architectural projects are just as important as those that design it. And architecture could learn a lot from the advertising industry, where you have a creative team and you have an accounts team who look after the client, make sure they're satisfied, manage the project, and let the creative team, because in a way it's a different side of the brain. And we tend to try, and all our architectural training is to try and churn out architects that can do everything. And in the UK, you're quite right that because most architects in the UK are one-man bands or small practices, that all our teaching in the past has been to get them to do everything. Well, I'd like to see more specialism so you can curate your own career. So if you wanted to, be the best in class at sustainability for 5 years or conservation, or you could go to an employer and pass specific exams or modules. And that would ensure that we're better paid if we can stress our specialisms. It doesn't mean to say you have to do that for the rest of your life, but you should be able to curate your own career and do what's relevant for you at any particular time, rather than at the moment we're trying to make all architects be the same, which I don't, and that's downgrading our worth and our reputation, I think. So I think I'm always looking for, I'm well aware of what we've done wrong, but I'm more concerned with what we can do to change it, and using technology as you're doing to try and make sure that we can do online courses, which would be available around the world, to ensure that we can raise the standard of not just architecture in the UK or in America, but in all the places where architecture is practiced. I mean, I had a meeting a couple of months ago with the Institute of Pakistani Architects, and they don't have any lifelong learning at all. Once you're an architect, you're an architect, which can't be right. So if we can team up with people around the world, because we're facing global issues, then we can all work together to create a better global community. That's what I'm aiming for.
Yes, I mean you came to Miami to be part of the World Architecture Festival, which is really an attempt to do precisely that. Maybe I could just go back to that to the definition of the architect, this from Alberti for a moment, because one of the kind of controversial moves you've made just recently is to not continue your subscription to the ARB, which is the body that confers the title architect on an architect. Could you perhaps maybe sort of clarify what the difference between the ARB and the RIBA is for our listeners, but also to maybe sort of comment on what were the motivations behind that particular move?
I'm not at all a confrontational person. I shy away from confrontation, and I always try and like to do things in a collaborative way. But this particular issue has been around for 20 or 30 years or more, and hasn't been able to be resolved. So at the moment, once you've done your sort of 7 years training as an architect, you then have to, if you pass all the exams and you've made it that far, you have to register with the Architects Registration Board in order to call yourself an architect. So the title of architect is protected, but the function of architect isn't. So anybody can do what an architect does. Anybody can submit a planning application, sign off a building certificate, design a building and get it built. And a lot of houses in the UK are built without architects. So I think that situation is ridiculous. It's ridiculous to regulate the title, but not the function. So I talked to quite a few of my friends and colleagues about it, and I said, now that I'm president, what would happen if I resigned and couldn't call myself an architect, and it would just draw attention to the absurdity of the situation. And I was expecting the RIBA to say, "Oh no, you can't do that." But when I did mention it, nobody said it was ridiculous. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, this is a good time to do it, because the government is actually looking at the whole issue post Grenfell of how the all the professions in the building industry are regulated and contracted as well, contractors as well. So I did it in order to draw attention to the absurdity of the situation, but it's actually been incredibly well received by the architectural profession and some of our other colleagues in the industry as a way of, because most countries in the world regulate either the title and the function, or there's specific things. So what we're asking for is there are specific things that an architect or a competent professional would have to be involved in. So that would be planning applications, environmental statements, design and access statements, practical completion certificates. So certain things are regulated so that you don't get anybody that's, and I do. I'm the first person to admit that if you can design if you can design something that a client wants, it shouldn't matter that you're an architect or not. I mean, some of really, the several architects, there's several designers practicing as architects, and they aren't fully qualified. And sometimes that freedom of not actually having studied architecture gives them a freedom of being able to design more creatively, a bit more like a sculptor than an architect or an engineer. So it's a broad profession, and you shouldn't have to, study architecture in order to do architecture. But there are certain functions that you ought to have to be fully qualified in the same way as a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer should be. So that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, Zaha herself, Zaha Hadid was not didn't actually take up part three until she was, well into her kind of years of practice, and there are obviously other examples of that throughout the world. So, yes, for sure. Yes, I mean, I guess, but how would that work? How would you actually do that, though? I mean, in terms of regulating the function, wouldn't that lead to all sorts of kind of bureaucracies? How would that be handled as such?
No, I mean it would be quite simple. The practicalities of it are quite simple. That it would need to be a good, and that's what we're doing at the moment with government, with lobbying government to say, look, in order to ensure the safety of buildings and make sure that things are designed properly and sustainably and ethically, uh, then architects ought to have more of a role in that process. So other countries do it. Switzerland is a famous example where even small houses have to be designed by an architect. There are some smaller projects. You don't have to have an architect for an extension, for example, but you have to have an architect for a building. So I think and it seems sensible to do that, and to ensure design quality and to ensure that things are done properly and safely.
So, I mean, I don't know if you've watched Patrick Schumacher in his recent interviews, but one of the things he's been arguing for is that what is stifling uh, construction in London are all the regulations. What would your position be on that? Are you for a kind of releasing those regulations and allowing the profession to go forward, or do you think they're a necessary part to safeguard certain things?
Well, we've talked a lot about this, you and I, and in your lectures, you talk a lot about regulation when it comes to AI and what's happening with technology. I think regulation is a very important thing. You need to have rules. You can't let everybody just do what they want. You have to have rules about which side of the road you're going to drive on, or things just become, chaotic. So I think certain regulations, and I think they should be as few as possible. But I think uh, I think people should be able to make their own choices. But sometimes you need regulation to make sure that because it's not just your own house you're building. You're eventually going to sell it to somebody else, and it's important that we have controls for how buildings go together and how fire is, how we protect against fire if we're building next to somebody else's house. So I think there are very important issues that do need to be regulated. So I don't think I'm not asking for anything other than trying to make sure that everything is done in a sensible way, but trying to keep the regulations as few as possible, I think. I mean, it's
Mm.
interesting. I was at a meeting with the Union of International Architects, and in Germany, they've introduced that they're quite aware that we are regulating too much often, and that the standards that there's even regulations of how many sockets, electric sockets, you need to have in a room, and it's getting out of hand. And so a group of architects have actually got together and agreed with the government that there was, for, you don't have to meet those regulations. You can apply to meet a lower class of regulations if your client signs up for that. But it's about your client knowing what the regulations ought to be and how many sockets there ought to be in the room, and then saying, well, actually, I don't want to pay for all of those sockets. And if the person that buys the house after me wants to put in those sockets, we all need to know what has been done. So I think there are ways around it so that you can actually agree amongst yourselves. You shouldn't, we're in danger of making everything too expensive and stifling the economy because we're putting in too many regulations. So I think that we do have to be sensible about it, or it does stifle growth.
No, I think over in the States, one of the key issues right now, or probably the key issue in some ways, is the question of insurance. The wildfires in Los Angeles, for example, and I understand you were there recently. It has basically meant that it's almost impossible to insure. Well, the insurance is basically saying that it's almost impossible to build up in the hills anymore. And I guess we're getting in similar in Miami. The risk is that with sea level rise, insurance is going to become the key constraint about whether or not you can proceed. Do you see insurance as being a kind of an important issue on the horizon?
Yeah, well, both of those instances are linked to climate change, and I think that's the biggest single issue we've got at the moment is, when Andrew and I started our practice, we both won awards for energy conservation and sustainability projects, and that was in 1985, and we're still not treating it with the urgency that we need to. And wildfires and floods are nothing new, but they're becoming far more common. And it'll be not enough water. There's all sorts of issues with those aspects of climate change that we're going to have to deal with. And climate change isn't just about being too hot to work or too cold to work, or it's going to affect water supply and the breaking down of society because we haven't got enough water, we haven't got enough power. Uh, that's going to come long before it gets too hot or too cold. So I think those issues are all allied to what we need to do and why we need to ensure that we're building in a fit and proper way. And in order to do that, you do need people that have been properly trained or properly, educated in how we need to design.
Maybe we could turn to AI itself. I mean, one of the things I thought was extraordinary was the fact that you invited Stuart Russell to come and talk at the RIBA before you became president. And I guess what I would say, most architects really just focus on the tools. They're interested in what can they do in the office, how can they use certain tools. And Stuart Russell is not a figure that they would necessarily have come across. Actually, we're in the UK. We've got a number of people who have been absolutely central in the development of AI. Alan Turing was possibly the first person who conceptualized AI. I mean, maybe people know about him now because of the movie The Imitation Game, but not many people realize that two of the very few people who have received the Nobel Prize for architecture for AI are from the UK, Geoffrey Hinton and Demis Hassabis, and the UK is really a powerhouse behind these things. And maybe I can just give just a little anecdote. Back in 2019, I was trying to kind of celebrate this and promote uh, or advertise or promote in an architectural context the role of AI. And we teamed up with Zahadid Architects and a few others with the idea of actually curating the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And we got nowhere. We got nowhere. We got nowhere. In fact, we weren't even shortlisted, which really goes to show that just back in 2019, AI was just not on the horizon. But I find your invitation to Stuart Russell astonishingly prescient to actually look beyond the tools and look at some of the figures who are, in a sense, leading the way, but also safeguarding the way. Could you just maybe say what was it that prompted you to invite Stuart Russell to come and talk to architects?
I think it was 2020. He did the Wreath lectures at the BBC, and he didn't just talk about, he talked a little bit about design in one of them, but he was talking more generally about all sorts of things, about the military, about medicine. And at that time, I just thought it was really interesting what he had to say. And I knew that I was going to be master of the company of architects in 2 years' time, and I had to organize the annual lecture. And I wrote to him and said, I found your talk fascinating. Would you like to talk about it specifically about the world of design and architecture? In the and he wrote back and said yes. And it was sort of a one-word reply. And I thought that made me very nervous about whether he would taking it seriously or not. But the thing within those 2 years, it was astonishing that everybody was then talking about AI. So by the time he came, and I invited you as well because I wanted you to talk. I was familiar with your work, and you were doing the practical examples of everything that he seemed to be talking about. So he was talking about the theory and the regulation and the rise of AI, but you were able to demonstrate exactly how it was being used. And the two together made everybody just suddenly sit up and think this is going to be amazing. And since then, there's not a day goes by that I either look at your Instagram or what you're doing or other people and the most astonishing things, and you can see the potential of it in our industry. And I personally think it's incredibly exciting. It's like rediscovering all the long lost theories about perspective that Michelangelo and Leonardo must have done. I mean, it's a rebirth of education, I think, and it's making people, giving access to a lot of people to possibilities of being able to imagine how the world's going to work. So, I don't know when this was written, about 7 years ago, I wrote about how modern technology is going to transform the way we travel, because that's what I've spent my career doing, looking at the way we move around our cities and the way that cities have changed because of public transport in particular, and looking at now modern ways of traveling between our cities and around our cities are going to transform our environment. So I think looking at it's something I've always been fascinated by, and the whole it's now happening so quickly, and it always happens in practice. It happens a lot slower than you think it's going to to be. I mean, you mentioned Roy the Rovers and all those comics. I mean, that post-war era to me was full of possibilities of tomorrow's world and look and learn and all those things that had a bright future, not just in the way that we traveled, but the way that we were going to live. And a lot of them are coming true. And the advances that we're making are quite incredible, really. So it is incredibly exciting, and we need to embrace it. You're quite right that Britain is doing a lot in inventing or discovering those ways. And the documentary that you put me onto, The Thinking Game, is just fascinating. But what you do notice is that other countries are then piggybacking on what we discover and applying it in practical situations a lot more than we are, I think. So in China, they're actually putting some of those discoveries that DeepMind have been coming up with into practical examples, and we just need to make sure that we keep at the forefront of that as well, not just making the discoveries, but utilizing them.
Yeah, I mean, I was brought up with Doctor Who, right? And there's kind of what I find interesting about Doctor Who was that, and I often connect it with Alan Turing because, Alan Turing, as we know, he was the one who cracked the Nazi Enigma code and brought the Second World War to an end years before it might have done and saved millions of lives. In a sense, Doctor Who is also, and it was Dr. Alan Turing, and Doctor Who is not a medical doctor. He's a doctor, or she is a doctor with a PhD in science and technology, who is saving the world in some ways. And I thought, well, could it just be that Alan Turing was the model for Doctor Who? But then it transpires, of course, the tragedy of Alan Turing is nobody realized what he'd done in his lifetime because this Official Secrets Act had kept secret what he had done in the war, and the information wasn't released till the 1970s, and then of course Doctor Who had started in the 60s. So at the same time, Doctor Who was a Time Lord, so maybe we can't make that argument for him. But there is kind of interestingly, in a subliminal level, there is a kind of celebration of that sort of technology that was written into things. I think Arthur C. Clarke was another British figure. Of course, he was part of the he was collaborating on the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. But maybe I could just pick up on little something here, and that is to say, Sir Stuart Russell has been an extraordinary figure in terms of promoting AI. He's also been a very significant figure in terms of warning us of the dangers of AI. I don't know whether you know the movie that he produced called Slaughterbots, so a kind of documentary that he sponsored. It's about the dangers of a use of autonomous weapons. And it came out some time ago. I'm just guessing about 2013. And looking at kind of modern warfare, the role of drones, and he was talking precisely about drones that could go in and murder people. Astonishingly prescient in some ways. And the other issue that he wrote a book called Human Compatible about the alignment, the problem of alignment of AI being aligned to human values. So he was very much aware of the positive, both the positive and the negative side of AI. And of course, the same is true of Arthur C. Clarke, in a sense. In that movie, it starts off being very positive about the role of informational technologies, these curious monoliths that appear, but also, of course, famously, HAL 9000, the supercomputer on board the spaceship, turns against human beings. So that's, I guess, to what extent, I mean, this technology is extraordinary, but it's also potentially quite terrifying. And how do you think, how could we address the potential dark side of AI, the kind of Black Mirror side of AI, and what threat do you think it might hold for the profession of architecture in particular?
Yeah, I think at the moment anyway. I mean, it will. I think so. Stuart Russell did talk a lot about regulation and what we that does have to be built into the system. But like you, I've been fascinated by science fiction for ages, and fantastic films like Silent Running and Space Odyssey. Um, and they are that they are really interesting to look at. Not only, but often they use 1950s Charles Eames furniture because they can't think of anything more modern than that. But it is, but they and I mean, it's not just. I think people with imagination, and often if it's in Hollywood or whatever, they're thinking ahead of thinking of potential problems with the way that we're living. So films like Contagion about the pandemic, it's not just about the future of living, it's about how we live and the dangers that we are imposing in, mass farming and the way food is produced. So I think, but in terms of AI, we at the moment, it seems to me like it's being used mainly to generate ideas, and you can look at lots of different alternatives, which would normally take a long time, and you still need that critical thinking in order to utilize it. Whether in the future that critical thinking will be taken away from the architect is debatable. I still think at the moment, in the same way that a doctor makes the final decisions about a patient, you can get the AI to analyze all the data, but you still need the doctor to make the final decision. I think it will. It will be really interesting to know whether that will be designed out. And if it is, I mean, in the same way that driverless cars, we're kind of at that tipping point at the moment, and it will be interesting to see where it goes. But humans aren't infallible, and if machines are less infallible, then we should probably let them do it. I don't know, but I think it you know, I can't remember somebody said that nobody's in danger of losing their jobs to AI. You lose your job to the person that's using the AI, not to the AI itself. So I think we all need to learn to use it, I think, and to know how we can use it to our advantage in whatever creative or manufacturing field that we're in.
Maybe I could just pick up on that particular quote because I talk about it quite a lot. In fact, there was a professor from Harvard, from the Harvard Business School, who made that comment. I forget his name right now, but what was interesting was he was also part of a study that was done 2023, I think, which is looking at the impact of ChatGPT on the office, and it was a very serious study. It was done with sociologists, and it was a controlled academic study. And what that found, and this is dealing with a technology that's vastly improved since then. What that found was that basically the quality of the work coming out was 40% better, and that's very positive. 40% was is I mean it's if you think about it, that's if you imagine, I don't know, I used to be a runner. So, imagine Usain Bolt in a 100-meter race, right? And then he's 40 meters ahead of everyone else. I mean, that doesn't happen, 2 or 3 meters. But so the advantages are hugely significant and absolutely astonishing. But what that study also showed was that you could improve the speed of production by 25%. Now, if you just take that, and maybe since then the ratio has gone up or something because the technology has improved, but if you just take that, if it improves the speed of production, that kind of suggests if it's 25% that now four people can do with AI what five people could do in the past without AI, which means just through straight mathematics, that AI does actually take jobs away. It will eventually have an impact on the workforce. We will not need so many architects. Does that, I mean, of course, we'll need architects to take charge of things, but still, we probably won't need so many in the future.
All we do, we'll do other things. I mean, there are jobs. There are jobs that my friends do now that trained as architects, which are more to do with community involvement and uh, management of stakeholders that are essential to get projects done. So I think, and you still need to be trained as an architect to do that. It comes back to what I was saying before about the broadness of the profession and not thinking of architects as people that design something and make things look nice. AI can do that, and AI is already, is already capable of helping with the production information and costings and things like that. So I think we will. I think it'll be used for the environment, the built environment, and for the quality of our designs to get better. We might not do what we've done in the past, but we will still have an important role to play in the critical thinking and putting the project as a whole together. And in some ways, that's a good thing that it'll allow designs to be better, even for people that aren't good designers. I mean, it'll allow more specialisms within the profession. So I think it will be, as long as we use it wisely, it'll improve the whole of the built environment, and not put us all out of work, but give us other things to do to improve how projects are procured.
Maybe I could just pick up on the software part of you things because I mean for me AI is just soft in the end it's just
Yeah.
software, very sophisticated, but it is software. And one of the things we're seeing already in firms like Xcool is that they are embedding in the software building control constraints, planning constraints, all that stuff is embedded in. So you can't, as you know, you can't do anything that's out of line with what
Yeah.
is required by the regulations. But let's just think about that way into the future. Well, maybe not so far into the future. And what that might suggest to me is that some of the controls that we have that are existing controls, going back to the ARB, the RIBA, whatever it is, could themselves be taken up by the software. In other words, as long as you're using the software, you cannot not conform to all the constraints. Um, to the point that maybe even you don't have to apply for planning permission because already it's embedded in the software. What would your position be on that possibility?
Yeah, you could do that already. I mean, but it does you need it, it does take away the creativity you'd have to write the program with so many or so few constraints that you would be able to, it would become like a checklist. And interestingly, the government's new national planning policy attempts to do that. It attempts to say there are these things that if you adhere to, and if you adhere to those things, you get planning permission straight away. But it's very, very difficult to do that you know, and still make designs interesting. I mean, I once heard Piers Goff lecture, and he said, if I own a site, I should be able to build whatever I want on it as long as it's not interfering with anybody else, as long as it's not. But you then just come to you think, well, what is interfering with somebody else? There's lots. There's lots of things that you'd have to be. You'd have to write the program in such a way that it would allow the AI to design and be able to submit the planning application and actually do it. It's a very difficult one to square. It all comes down to individual taste at the end of the day. What planning, what you get permission for, and the power of your argument. So I think there are certain things that it is going to be difficult for AI to do. I can't really see that being achieved anytime soon. But it is a logical extension of the whole process. In the same way that when we all started using Revit, there was clash detection for services and structure, and that was seen as a novelty that you couldn't put a duct through a beam like you could in the past, and without noticing it. But so it is a logical extension of that design process, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe I could just to be provocative here. Going back to the documentary, was it The Thinking Game? I forget the one I recommended to you. Uh, about Demis Hassabis and DeepMind
Yeah.
in London. I mean, in a sense, once you've got everything constrained by rules, it's a bit like a game of chess in some senses. You can't move your queen in certain sort of ways. You've got to conform to that. And of course, the movie, a documentary about Demis Hassabis was fascinating because he was a prodigy as a chess player. At the age of 4 or something, he was playing for the British team or something. And then, of course, he produced this. He was testing out his ideas. Gary Kasparov had already been beaten by IBM's Deep Blue, and his intervention, some 20 years later, was to take on one of the leading Go players in the world, Lee Sedol, and which of course is much more challenging than the game of chess. As he points out, there are more potential moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe, and he had to kind of engage with this deep learning revolution, which is really what we've got now. That's what ChatGPT is based on, and so on and so on and so on. Anyway, what happened in this game of Go, as you probably remember from that documentary, there was an astonishing move that was made by AlphaGo, move 37 in game two, a move that had never been made before. In other words, out of these constraints, there was something novel. I mean, creative, perhaps we could maybe use that term. I don't know. And then what was so significant about that whole project, and it had been written into what they were planning to do in the first place, is that we're not interested in the game of Go. We're interested in the principles behind the game of Go and then applying them in other domains. And Interestingly, XCool has taken some of the principles from AlphaGo Zero, the next generation, and used them in architecture. But of course, what happened was AlphaFold, which was the project to predict the structure of proteins that won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
So that was what was so astonishing about Demis Hassabis. He says things and he follows through on what he wants to do. And of course, now they're working on cancer, and there are positive signs that they're making headway in that. So in some senses, those constraints could lead to a highly novel and a different way of operating where the rules of the game are changed completely, but the benefits are there. So I don't know if that's something that kind of rings true with you, whether you think out of all these constraints, something it's not going to constrain us so much as open up possibilities and maybe alternative ways of thinking about how the world should be.
Yeah, definitely. I think what was really interesting about the whole documentary is just how fast things happened. And as you say, a bit like Steve Jobs, he would say something knowing what he wanted to do, but without any idea of how he was actually going to do it. But just the fact that you know what you want and you know what you're aiming for. I mean, I guess when JFK said they were going to land a man on the moon, I mean, at that time they had no idea how they were going to do it. But it's, unfortunately, don't seem to be able to do that with climate change because it involves every country in the world rather than just one man's ambition to beat the Russians. But so I think seems to be a bit more difficult. But I think if you know what you want, then you've just got to work out how to do it. As long as that both of those people, Steve Jobs and Dennis Hasabi, knew what they wanted to do and could see a road there, even though they didn't know how it would be done. That they knew it could be done, and that they've both achieved it. And that's a fantastic thing. I mean, I think that you've got to have that single-mindedness, and you've got to be able to take everybody with you. You've got to have great leadership in order to make it happen. And I think that, but half of the problem is making sure you know what you want to achieve in the first place, and what the aim is, and then you've got to try and do something about it.
Maybe just a brief interjection there. I mean, I think uh, well, I had a student before ChatGPT came out. There was other sort of chatbots, and he did ask this chatbot, uh, "How do we solve climate change?" And the response was a bit unnerving. And it said, "Simple. We all know that humans are responsible for climate change. So eradicate human beings, and you solve the problem." So that was an interesting kind of response in some way. Um, so maybe I wanted maybe just to kind of to a final sort of question, which may be actually quite a big question in some senses. One of the things I have been astonishingly impressed by, and I know very little about it, is the fact that you won an award for a film script. And we've spoken about movies and how prescient they are about the future. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what that film script was all about. And then finally,
Well,
okay,
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, so I think that I had this idea for a film script, or it's actually a play rather than a film at the moment. Although I would love to see it in Hollywood, but I'd had the idea for a while, and it's partly because of the age that I am. And a lot of architects that I've met are in the final years of their life, and they're interested in their legacy, or some of them are, what they're going to leave behind. And not just architects, but a lot of career professionals in general, men and women. So it's partly about the rivalry between Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, but it's actually set in the time of Leonardo and Michelangelo. One of them wants to be the best in the world, and gets really annoyed if anybody else wins a project that he wants, and he wants to win everything, wants to be the best in the world. The other one wants to be is more involved, more interested in the things, the ideas, and learning and finding out how the world works, and not really uh, as interested in what he's going to leave behind, but how he lives his life. And so it's called Legacy, and so Michelangelo died with a fortune underneath his bed, and it's sort of without any friends and without any but he'd done all these amazing works. He was a workaholic. And Leonardo died in the arms of the King of France. He hadn't actually got any money of his own, but he was treated like a king because of the way that he thought and the way he inspired people. And he hardly finished anything, but he had notebooks of future ideas that he hardly ever showed to anybody else. So it's about what inspires you and what you think your legacy is going to be, and the contrast between the two of them. And a lot of people worry about what they're going to leave behind. The reason I've set it in the past is because it's more of an interesting setting, but also 500 years later, we still can't decide who was the creative genius, Michelangelo or Leonardo. And it just goes to show the futility of what of the question anyway, and why legacy should matter in the least, because no matter how So when Queen Elizabeth died, our Queen, a few years ago, I was in Cairo, and I went to the new museum that they've got there, where there's about 15 pharaohs laid out in a room, and it's really amazing to see all these dead kings. Uh, and they're all dead, and you can see them all. They've all been preserved, and it just makes you realize that for all the wealth you've got, all the gold, all the silver, here you are in a room with everybody gawping at you, and it's not really worth bothering with. We should all try and enjoy what we do, and try and do something while we're here, but not really worry about what we're going to leave after us, I think. So
Well, okay.
that's what it's trying to be about. I'm not really as good a writer as I would like to be, but
Well, no,
that's the idea.
you could use AI for that maybe. But I mean, so but what? I mean, so which one is Richard Rodgers and which one is Norman Foster?
I think Richard Rogers is more involved, was more interested in the ideas and a futuristic vision, and certainly, imagine he did more work imagining in what the future might be, rather than. But I think Norman is more like Michelangelo in that he wants to he has something that really spurs him on. I think he's brilliant. I love the guy, but he wants to win everything, and he wants to do. He gets annoyed if Raphael beats him to a competition or Bramante or whoever, and he wants to. Win every project, and still at the age of 90 is still wanting to do everything, and he does it pretty well, I think.
So James Sterling wasn't in that sort of configuration because when I was a
Well,
student, maybe the three.
yeah, true, I want I wanted to try and keep it simple.
Yeah, and maybe it's your kind of working class roots that's wanting to support Richard Rodgers because he had a very strong social agenda about the city, about public spaces, and so on and so on.
Yeah, no, true. But then Norman came from a very humble background and has certainly done incredibly well. Um, but they're both incredibly interesting characters. And I think that's what I love about architecture is everybody. I play tennis on a Sunday night, and everybody plays tennis with a bunch of architects. Everybody plays tennis in exactly the same way that they design. There's one guy that is incredibly creative and it can often has difficulty getting planning permission for things, and he's always trying things that he shouldn't actually try on the tennis court. And there's one guy who runs an incredibly successful practice of about 400 people that is just incredibly controlled and incredibly measured. I think you take your personality into sort of everything that you do, and I've learned a lot about sport and about business, and that feeds into the way that you go about your architecture and the way that you live your life, basically. I think so. Yeah, goes back to my religious roots, probably. I don't know.
I wanted to pick up on those things, Chris, because I don't know if you know this, but I was I'm not actually I'm not actually so religious now, unless you call architecture a religion. We'll come back to that in a second. But I was taught in a monastery, a Benedictine monastery in the south of England, where all the monks, who were astonishing individuals, I've got to tell you, they were very interesting individuals, and they had nothing. They had a drink allowance and a tobacco allowance and a communal van, but really no possessions. And yet they were very astonishingly capable individuals. Most of them had the top degrees from Oxford or Cambridge, and were quite sporting and capable in many sort of ways. And one of them in particular, I always remembered Father Dominic, was particularly handsome. And I was kind of like, I was always struck by what we had from parents' days. And when all the mothers would want to talk to Father Dominic about their son's history essay. And I thought, that's a bit strange. Why is that happening? And then someone said, he looks a bit like Sean Connery. So we have this kind of echoes of Name of the Rose and things. But what they taught me, which is kind of interesting in a way, they were not interested in possessions. It was almost like Buddhist, they were kind of thinking, because you don't actually own anything when you don't own anything literally, because when you die, you can't take it with you. There's no such thing as a possession, that you kind of borrow things, you loan things or whatever while you're alive. And that was, I think, a hugely important lesson for me, and kind of goes into why Digital Futures itself exists. In other words, let's not worry about money so much or possessions so much, because in the end, we don't actually know quite what Michelangelo had under his bed or whatever, or Leonardo. We just judge them by what they've done, their legacy, their contribution to society. But it did strike me that I mean, there were these monks wearing black with no money, and I guess I became an architect wearing black and with no money. But it did strike me at the time that model of religion, not so much religion as religion, but religion as a kind of way of life, is absolutely appropriate to the model of the architect in some senses. So I completely agree with you in the sense that if you want to be an architect, if you want to make money, become an accountant or something like that. But if you want to be an architect, you've got to live it, you've got to breathe it, you've got to whatever, sleep it, you've got to work it. It is an all-pervasive outlook on life that should feed into everything you do in a certain sort of way. So it's more a kind of lifestyle or a kind of philosophical outlook, or indeed a kind of a social outlook, than necessarily a profession for making money. I've always thought that, and this is backed up by a comment by the head of department chair, that when I was teaching at the University of Nottingham, my first ever job as an academic, and Peter Fawcett, he said he went to the Bauhaus and he said, this is as close as I got to a religious experience of seeing the Bauhaus. So I do think that model needs to be interrogated, because I think the essence of what an architect is I think you're correct. It is a kind of a religion.
There is that's a train of thought which is very appealing, I think, and I agree. I think, but we are providing a commercial service as well. I mean, when you look at how corrupt the church used to be in the time of Michelangelo and Leonardo, that there has always been devout Christians that are only interested in religion, but then there's been popes and cardinals that are interested in commerce as well. And I think that's where architecture is at the moment. There are some that see it as a vocation, but when I was studying architecture, Norman Foster said that there's no reason why art and business shouldn't coexist. And the idea of an artist like Van Gogh starving in his garret, creating the most, well, you've got to have a business brain as well as an artistic brain, I think. And in the same way that as a monk, you've still got to have a patron, or you've still got to have somebody, some way of paying for the roof over your head and your meals. Yeah, so I think it is a dilemma, but I think a lot of architects, they're either too poor or too rich, possibly, and we need to find a way of making sure. What I'm interested in is elevating the whole of the profession, and making sure that we're all seen as being, worthy of our position in society, and well respected and well acknowledged, because we might not have all the answers, but we've got a lot of them. And I think we've lost our sphere of influence with politicians and decision makers, and our voice isn't heard as strongly as it should be. And when it comes to things like AI in design and copyright and all those things, we should have a voice at the table and decide help decide with the government how we're going to use that, who is going to control copyright, who is going to, ensure the design is safe. So all those things need to be thought of.
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, okay, just as a kind of comment, I do think that that economics or the financial world is a bit of a blind spot for architects in some senses. I mean, there'd be no, I mean, I don't think it'll ever be done over by an architect, because we're just gullible and, we're quite prepared to work all night on a competition in which maybe the prize money won't even cover the cost of the model or the whatever we're doing, at the end. So we're this kind of charmingly kind of altruistic profession, not concerned enough about money. And if you actually do look at any book on architecture, and I would challenge you to even Alberti's book on architecture to find any reference to cost apart from the price of the book on the back cover. That's really what. So it is a kind of in a sense, a charming black spot or a blind spot, shall we say, in the outlook of the architect.
Yeah, it still is. This is how I'm spending my Saturday, designing something like this, if you can see that. Just playing with models and but that's why we love it, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I mean, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but there's a couple of questions in the chat, which I think are kind of interesting in some ways. You mentioned about the title of architect being protected, but not the function. If designing can be done without the title, does the architect's role shift to orchestrating, in brackets, composing or spatial authorizing systems and ideas? I think with AI, we could also lose title. I don't know if you can see that in the chat
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think I've never been that interested in titles, which is why I was willing to give up the title of architect. But I realized that it's important to a lot of architects because it has a commercial aspect to it, and that's why I've done it, so that other people don't need to draw attention to the fact that the title is regulated, but the function isn't. So to me, as president of the RIBA, I don't need to use the title of architect, but for a sole practitioner in Colchester to ask them to give up the title of architect would be commercially disastrous, probably. But I think there are certain things that the function needs to ensure, and it's really about safety and ethics and competence in order to regulate those things.
I think, it's kind of interesting that you're not interested in title coming from your particular background, because in some ways, what would that mean in terms of title? It's almost like you would be judged, let's say, through your connection to the royal family. And actually, no architect is judged in that way. They're judged on their works. Ultimately, it's the quality of their work, and that's how we value them. If they're connected to the royal family, we don't care at all, right? In some ways, and coming from a place where you didn't have that authority of that kind of background. And incidentally, Alberti also was illegitimate, and he didn't have any authority at all. So coming from that background, maybe I could see why title wouldn't be that necessary. But no, it's a very complex and interesting issue. So
Yeah.
we have another question here. And if the function of architecture survives without the title of architect, does architecture itself no longer need a profession to exist? Now that's a fantastic question. Let me repeat that. If the function of architecture survives without the title of the title of architect, does architecture itself no longer need a profession to exist?
Well, that's the situation at the moment. Anybody can design a building, and anybody can carry out the function of an architect without the title. But I don't think that's the right thing to do. We need to ensure, particularly as buildings need to become more specialized, that the right people are properly trained to do the right things. So and that will involve, because you couldn't just, you wouldn't trust a brain surgeon who just had an interest in mindfulness you need to have properly trained people doing the right roles, I think. So we've got the wrong way around where the title is protected, but the function isn't.
Yeah. So my view is, I mean, interestingly, I used to do life drawing classes with one of the world's most famous surgeons who did the first triple heart bypass, whatever. And he couldn't draw a body very well, which was a bit alarming in some ways. But I think one of the things I think that is going to survive, this is my view, and as we're working with the world of AI, we're changing, or we're shifting. Our role is shifting from being so much the genius creator to being the curator, because AI is throwing out these options, but we still have to have an eye to be able to judge which is the right option, and then you can kind of start breeding it when you're using AI in some ways. So I think in the end, we what will survive more than anything else is the kind of the issue of taste, of exquisite, what's the right word for this now? But the ability to recognize what is good and to act as this kind of curatorial figure. That always strikes me as the case.
Yeah, I mean, the architects practice in lots of different ways, in the same way that every football team has a different style or different way of management. But so I went to Renzo Piano's office in Genoa a couple of years ago, and I was amazed to find out there's only 50 people in Genoa in his office, and there's 50 people in his office in Paris, and that's it. He outsources a lot of the working drawings. So he doesn't want an office of 200 people just doing the working drawings. He wants to be able to control the working drawings and dictate how they look, but not to actually do them. So I think, but the people that do his working drawings don't get the credit that they deserve. And I think that, it's our own fault that we've kind of put all our eggs in one basket these days. And whereas when Christopher Wren built St. Paul's, he knew that he was involved he knew the masons, he knew the carpenters, he knew the costs, he knew the engineering. He was in control of the whole thing. One by one, we've let go of everything. I think AI gives us a chance to get that back and to be in control of the whole process. We don't need to do everything, but we can control it, and make it work to our advantage.
So, in other words, we might all be heading towards Renzo Piano kind of models of existence, where AI is doing the working drawings, but we're curating the kind of the bigger
That's
picture.
what I would like to see, but that enables us to free up the system of architectural education and architectural training, and for us to concentrate on whatever we're good at or whatever parts of the architectural process we specialize in. And I think there will be people that will be checking the working drawings, and we should involved in different parts of working more as a team than as a master builder, in order to make sure that everything gets done properly.
So, on the whole, you're positive about the potential of AI.
I am, but I've always written a 5 year plan where I want to be 5 years in the future. The older you get, you realize you haven't got many more 5 year plans left. So unfortunately, I am incredibly excited about the future, but I'm also conscious that I'm not going to be around to see an awful lot of it. But it is an incredibly exciting time, I think, to be involved in architecture and to try and have some influence in how it's going to work out.
No, I think in the end, it's really a question of what legacy we leave behind. And obviously, in your case, it's going to be the legacy of what you have done as the RIBA president, but also the legacy of your works in Western Williamson. Williamson, could you just maybe, we want to finish off so that people know exactly, because we haven't shown any images and so on, but maybe kind of give us a sense of what are the projects that you've done that you're most proud about that we could, those who are watching could go and follow up and
Yeah.
see.
So my career hasn't been at all what I thought it was going to be like, to be honest. I mean, I met Andrew Weston, my partner, when we studied together, and we were put together purely in alphabetical order by a tutor who asked, for group projects. And we found that we liked the same things, we liked the same style of architecture, but we both had different skills. And 40 years later, we're still working together. So that's been amazing. But just by chance, we lost one. We'd won a competition to design an office building, and there was a property crash in 1989, and we'd done all the working drawings for it and got paid for it, but the client decided not to build it. So we had some money in the bank, but we'd lost our biggest project. And we then got asked to design the London Bridge station on the Jubilee line. And that was like 5 years or 6 years worth of work. And we got a lot of repeat business after that. And we because engineers travel a lot more than architects do, we were able to hold on to their coattails and go. So we've been able to work in Singapore and Australia and Canada and the Middle East, working with engineers that we worked on. So we found that we liked those sort of city shaping projects, because when you put a new tube line somewhere, you alter the shape of the city. And London has become emerged again as a polycentric city. So if you look at where the major stations are and the new infrastructure, there are new clusters of towers and new. So not everybody is coming into the centre and going out again at 5 o'clock. There's lots. It gives people a choice of where to live and work, and helps shape the city in a different way. So a lot of countries around the world look at London and how that's managed to change, to get rid of the cars out of the centre. So that's been, we started our practice on the basis of sustainability, but in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher got uh, elected Prime Minister, nobody was interested in sustainability. And but it's quite interesting that our work, getting people out of cars onto public transport has been a major achievement. So it's something I'm quite proud of looking back. But you have to go where life takes you, and you can't always. It's not always planned. You can have a 5-year plan, but you have to be prepared to change it along the way. So Paddington Station and Woolwich Station, we've just finished on the Elizabeth line, if people want to look at those, and the Melbourne Metro, which we've just finished with Hassels and Richard Rogers in Australia. And we've been working on NEOM in Saudi Arabia, which is an incredibly exciting futuristic project. And we're still doing, city shaping projects in different parts of the world. So that's what I've been involved with mainly.
Wow. So is the more recent refurbishment of London Bridge station, is that your work or someone else's work?
No, so interestingly, but when we were working on the London Bridge Underground station, Terry Fowle was doing the overground station at the time. But because we had different clients, we weren't allowed to talk to each other. But surreptitiously, we got together in the evenings and did a scheme. And in a very British way, sort of 40 years later, Nick Grimshaw and his team have done a fantastic scheme for London Bridge Station. But it was very similar to the one that his former partner came up with. 40 years ago. So it all happens in a very British way. We don't have grand visions like other countries do, but we do get things done eventually.
Chris, we've got one final question in the chat. And I want to give you time to go back to your model making on a Sunday. But this one final question, maybe you could just quickly look at this one. When AI is treated with suspicion in architecture schools, is skepticism towards AI in architectural education about protecting architecture or protecting academic authority? Let me read that again. When AI is treated with suspicion in architecture schools, is skepticism towards AI in architecture education about protecting architecture or protecting academic authority?
It hasn't been my experience. I visit a lot of architecture schools in the UK, and it hasn't been my experience that it's seen as not being a positive thing. I think the thing I like about architectural education is that it does teach you how to think critically, and I think we've got to, so part of the education system has to be, we have to make sure that that is maintained. But I think I spend a lot of time with students, and I still see them as being incredibly enthusiastic and energetic and talented using AI and being involved in it. I haven't noticed a skepticism towards it. I think we still need to develop the creative side, but being able to use AI intelligently is part of that creative side. So I think the two should go hand in hand, and that's certainly what I would like to see as president going forward, is that we're using it as a tool to embrace rather than ignore it, to make sure that it's taught properly.
Yeah, and just, I mean, as an aside, of course, there is that difference between just kind of surrendering to the tool and getting ChatGPT to write it for you and using the tool. So in other words, not doing any critical thinking, just saying, okay, I'm going to do that. And there was a study actually at MIT that showed that those who were using it in that way, their brains shut down. But then there's the alternative thing about using it as a tool with which to think critically. And that is a very different mode of operating. And I personally think, because a lot of my students are doing this anyway, that it's not just 40% improvement in terms of the quality, it's beyond that, towards 80% improvement in terms of the quality when you're using it as a tool to have a dialogue with a critical dialogue. And so I see it as enhancing critical thinking, potentially.
Yeah,
And that's
I do. And I think I follow the work that you're doing, and I love the way that you're using it in that way. It's a, you know, and that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of optimism. It's people that aren't using it in the same way that we need to worry about, because you know there's a danger. It's the same in the music industry. You can use it creatively, or you can use it to churn out something that somebody else has done before, and just with minor differences. It's all in the hands of the people that are using it, but that's the same as a pencil. You know, it's always been like that.
absolutely. It's not a because the AI you can do for anything. I mean, a tool is who uses it and for what. I always say this: you can cut up your vegetables with a kitchen knife, or you can murder someone with it. It's absolutely the case. Chris, this has been wonderful. I'm sorry we've taken so long, but this is, I think, incredibly useful as a whole body of ideas that are hugely provocative. And I somehow see you as a kind of, in terms of a movie maker. I hope this movie comes out, because I think it's got a lot of interesting comment on how we should live, and not just architecture itself, but what are the value systems that we should subscribe to, you know. And I think that's anyway, so I hope that it does come out as a movie, and I'm sure maybe AI could help in that way. You know, you don't need Hollywood these days to produce a movie. But Chris, I'm enormously inspired by your example. You know, I still think of you in terms of Roy of the Rovers coming out of Ilkeston kind of thing. And I think you've shown us that we can achieve anything if you put your mind to it. And of course, that was Alberti's comment. You know, man may make whatever he will of himself. You know, provided he tries to do it. So you know, you're an example to all of us to what we can achieve. And And I think also your example of what you can achieve when you really think through the issues. It's, it's not a question of form, it's a question of understanding the system and working with the system. So, I'm very grateful for, I'm sure all our viewers are very grateful for your insights today. So thank you so much. And I want to leave you to go back to your religion, as it were. It's a Sunday, and you're working on your models. So thank you, Chris.
Very
That's been
much. Thank you.
fantastic.
Really enjoyed it. It's always nice speaking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.